One. Right, guys, welcome back to the Adam Peter Fitness Podcast. Today on the show, I have Thomas Lilley, who is the owner of Zero Weakness in Australia and is one of the more renowned Australian powerlifting coaches, along with Kelly Mann and Perform Motion. And most notably, coaches Colton Engelbrecht, who is doing some pretty great, crazy things in the sport, but he has also coached several other athletes to be quite competitive in the sport of powerlifting, not just Colton. How long have you been coaching for? I couldn't find that.
I started in 2012.
Yeah, so he's got clearly plenty of reps, and I think that the most important thing with coaching and what I look for is experience. Who have they coached? How long have they coached for? What's their track record of success? And I think that Thomas has some really interesting ideas. I was listening to a lot of your content with I first heard of you on the Reactive Training Systems podcast, a little more about your systems for movement, which I found very interesting. Because a lot of times we think about people are like, oh, there's not like one way to move. There's variation, but you have the opposite outlook that humans, there's generally a strongest way to move for most lifters. And I guess before I go into some specific technique things, I want to ask you, what got you to approach the sport of powerlifting that way as far as technique?
So I've always been very invested in technique. I've always believed that it plays probably the most pivotal role in terms of powerlifting success. If we think about it, on the platform, you express your strength via technique. And when we fail lifts, it's very rarely because of strength in the muscles that are moving the weight, right? So, like if you think about a squat, you very rarely fail a squat because your legs aren't strong enough to stand up with it. You fail a squat because the legs aren't able to transfer that force into the bar. There's breakdowns, there's bottlenecks, there's problems within that movement. And so solving for technique has always been a really important part of the process for me. I believe it dictates all of our programming decisions. Of course, it dictates the language that we use with clients. It gives us certain benchmarks to go by things. In terms of how I've arrived at the system we used, all coaches use systems. All coaches believe there is some form of like golden standard squat or bench or deadlift that they're working towards. Otherwise, they wouldn't change anything. They'd just accept this is the way that you move and that's okay. So we're all working towards something. It always bothered me that we didn't put a name or a standard to what that was. And what happened is, as I became more popular as a coach, people started asking me for mentoring, and I would just say, no, I don't do that. Eventually I just said yes. And so I started sitting down with coaches. And when you sit down and you say what you do out loud, it holds a mirror to you and you get to catch all your own bullshit. And so I was saying
Absolutely.
all of this stuff and saying, I'm saying this, but that doesn't sound right. I don't believe that. And so I have to go back to the drawing board and figure that out. And I went through this really iterative process of analyzing my own methodology and trying to, the mentoring accelerated my own analysis of what I was doing. So through that process of mentoring others and then creating we call it the coach development system, a course that people do to learn how to coach powerlifting, really solidified our own methodology.
I like that because I've also done some mentorship, and it does hold out that mirror like you said, and you really realize, okay, do I actually have valid strategies for how I program? And I think that I would agree with you with technique. I think that the biggest difference I see between like advanced lifters and like intermediates is that ability to actually stay in position and with that good technique under the heaviest of loads. Because like for example, coaches will obviously some of them will say having surrounding in your back is okay, and I think that as I've thought more about that, it's like I'm never actually cueing someone to the round your back. Like we're always trying to cue that extension because if you start to round more and more off the floor, you're going to have a harder time locking out and having a system. And I guess like when you're looking at somebody and you look at how they move, um, do you give them like this entire framework like all at once, or do you just give them like one cue and you're like, maybe this will help them fit into my technique, or how do you go about that as an online coach? Because I think it's a lot more easy to do that in person, but online it can be difficult to communicate that.
So the framework's given all in one. We have a series of sort of instructional videos, and then in the first check-in, we're going to go through everything. But I guess the differentiation is whether you're in person or online, that one exposure is not going to change shit. Like it's going to
Yeah.
be a consistent process over time, right? So it's really the question of like, what aspects of that do we lean into more and more over time? What aspects need more immediate attention? So if we're talking about something like a bench press, and the person's bench press is all over the place, their leg drive is all out of whack, their breathing and bracing sucks, their upper back sucks, it probably doesn't make as much sense in the early phases to go really hard on breathing, bracing, and the leg drive, because they're so much less important to the success of the bench press than what's happening at the shoulders, the upper back, what's happening up top, right? And same thing with the squat. If someone's upper back is all out of sorts, but their hips are awful, it probably makes more sense to direct focus into where the power is actually coming from before we lean into harder and harder into the other aspects of that technique. But of course, then there's a lot of like softer contextual stuff you have to consider. What is the level of this athlete? What's their reading comprehension, their ability to translate that into action? Like you might have to dial up or dial down certain aspects that you're trying to work on.
Yeah, for sure. Something you'll find too is I find the athletes that tend to do the best in the sport too, like they tend to be able to actually put together like the technique cues that you kind of give them pretty well versus the people that have a harder time with that. They tend to struggle more and more with the sport, which kind of goes back to what you were saying about technique being such a big deal. Now you've already gone a lot over this on other podcasts. I don't want to go too much into like what you've already talked about. I did want to talk about some other things, so I think that are a little more specific to untested powerlifting and/or federations that are not the IPF affiliates or USAPL with different bars and how to use that on like a deadlift bar, squat bar, and whatnot. And so I want to ask you if you're coaching someone who's deadlifting on a deadlift bar, what are some things that you tell them that might be different for somebody with a stiff bar, if anything?
Yes, I don't know if I buck the trend here or not, but there would be no difference whatsoever because the movement is exactly the same. Where the difficulty is the transition. So, like if you had always pulled on a stiff bar and now you're switching to a deadlift bar, it would be painting the expectation of what this will be like. So that's the only time it's difficult. Whereas if you always pull on a stiff bar or you always pull on a deadlift bar, you're just coaching a deadlift. It doesn't really change. It's the change in bar, and even as simple as I coach Danny Grigsby, Coach Colton, Coach Theo. These guys that are pulling 400 plus, the difference between a Texas bar and a Kabuki bar, for example, makes a difference to
Yeah.
what to expect, and therefore might need some uh, technical cueing or tweaking. It's not in the fundamentals of the movement itself, but rather the approach to the movement to match the expectation of what's going to happen. So if the bar's way whippier and you're a very snappy deadlifter, you snap into it, it's normally about slowing that down so the whip doesn't throw you out of position as soon as it comes off the floor, kind of thing. Outside of that, the cueing and the technique's the same. In the other direction, so taking a lifter that pulls really heavy from a deadlift bar to a stiff bar, it's like doing a deficit deadlift. So
Right.
there's going to be more to focus on around, especially if they're a sumo puller, more to focus on around, well, your hips are normally going through this range of motion. Now there's going to be like an extra inch of range of motion or 2 inches of range of motion that you're going to have to acclimatize to. And that can completely change how a lift feels. Doesn't change the fundamental technique, but the expectation, the feeling, the experience, that's where it starts to come into play.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned it's all about the transition point. And what's something I've noticed is that, as you get heavier and heavier and heavier with the deadlift bar, that transition point is even more of like a fine tune with the whip is just gets so whippy when you get to be like above 300 kilos. And then I can't imagine what 400 feels like. But,
Yeah.
the fundamental movement pattern is the same. I think the main thing I tell my clients is, I always cue them to sort of start like higher than what the bar allows them on both bars, because I find that tends to people tend to like be too crunched over in my opinion, when they're deadlifting a lot of times. And if you tell them to just drive as high as possible, it kind of pulls that slack out of the bar a little bit better in my experience, especially on a deadlift bar. Um,
Mm. The
but
other
as
the other thing you get, sorry to cut you off. The other thing you
good,
get that I just thought of just now, people who think that doing a whole heap of stiff bar training is going to translate to their deadlift bar strength or whatever, and you could argue about that all the time, as much as you want. Sorry, but one serious consideration is what happens with grip as well. Like the difference in the
yes.
diameter of the bar. You see people that train a lot on stiff bars and then switch to a deadlift bar experience callus tears, grip issues because of where they get used to setting their hand in the bar. and it's a 2 millimeter difference in the diameter of the bar, but it makes a huge difference when you're at max weight.
Yeah, especially with like the bar like bending in your hand, like that tends to make a huge difference with or you need to put the bar in your hand. I usually tell people to like lift like put it like around like their the lowest part of their hand, like right around there, like I don't know what you call that,
Mm,
like the top of the palm, like it's a deadlift bar versus like a stiff bar. I find you can be like a lot more finger tip grippy because you're not having the same bend. Is that what you've
mm.
seen in your experience?
Yeah, I mean the so when you go to a thicker bar, sorry, from a thicker bar to a thinner bar, there's just that room to roll, and that rolling is
Right.
what causes the tearing. So either way, you want to have it as deep as deep in towards your fingertips as possible without sacrificing your overall grip.
Mhm.
It's also going to throw a spanner in the works for people who pull hook, because a fatter bar, if you've got a short, stumpy thumb, all of a sudden that can be the difference between getting a solid hook and not.
Well, on that topic too, what do you is like? Do you have a system that you use when you're trying to determine like should an athlete use a hook grip or a mixed grip on a deadlift?
No, not at all. I think people over science the grip. I don't actually think it makes that much of a difference at all, if at all in general. And I'm working with a sample size of probably close to 2,000 people over the years. So when people ask things like, "Does a mixed grip cause imbalances?" I can't confidently say it causes
Yeah,
any imbalance whatsoever. So I don't think that's anything to worry about. Any comments around range of motion don't seem to add up, because if you add range of motion or remove range of motion in one place, you normally do the opposite of it in another place. So let's say you can quote unquote lengthen your arms with a hook grip. All that means is it's going to make your lockout harder, because now your
right.
shoulders are further forward and they have to come back eventually. So you're just transferring difficulty from one place to another. So yeah, it's really, really, really down to personal preference more than anything. I don't think one is more superior than the other. And I mean, we see that. We see that in just like if you look at all the best deadlifts in the world, there's not a strong correlation between hook or mixed and what happens at the top end.
I agree. I mean, one thing I want to ask too is you'll see some lifters like put like straps or like wraps around their wrist to kind of like have that passive tension on the flexors of the hand. Do you find that makes any difference at all?
No, no, it's a
Yeah.
funny thing. Like again, that's a personal preference, but like if you squeeze your hand, like if you take one hand and squeeze the other wrist, you're gonna get that tendon action. I'm trying to do it, but I can't. I tore my bicep the other week. I just had the surgery. Uh, if you're doing that and then you say, "Hey Thomas, grab my fingers and unbend them," it takes very little force for me to just straighten your
Right.
hand out. So like that wrist wrap tendon crunching thing versus 300 kilos in your hand, the 300 kilos is
Yeah.
going to win every time. So I definitely don't think it's an edge. However, if a lifter believes it's an edge, there's plenty of power to that. Because the question we have to ask, is there a problem with someone doing that? Is it going to make their deadlift worse or the grip worse? The answer is no. Then fucking go ahead.
Yeah. It's similar like using like wrist straps in the bench press. It's like if it makes you feel like more stable eventually, then like go ahead and do that. Uh, but it's not like knee sleeves on a squat where that does make a decent difference in my personal experience. So I think that we beat that to death. What about squat technique using a squat bar versus a power bar? Because the bar tends to be like longer and there can be more width associated with that, as well as the bar is thicker. Does that change maybe? But you might want to put the bar on your back.
Really depends on the barbell. So, if you look at a Texas squat bar, 32 millimeters, for some reason that barbell whips a hell of a lot more than an Eleiko barbell, for example. Well, I mean, the reason is the tensile strength of the steel. But if you get a Texas makes like a monster squat bar that's 35 millimeters. The old American brand I think was Mastodon. There's a brand in Australia called Goliath. There's a European brand called Strength Shop, or there's a few other brands anyway that make a 35 millimeter squat bar. That bar is never going to whip whatsoever. If anything, it feels a lot more stiff than an Eleiko at those kind of loads. That's why they were invented in the first place. So those 35 millimeter squat bars were invented because for two reasons. One, they were whipping too much above like 400 kilos when the multiply guys were doing it. And two, all those multiply guys were really fucking fat and immobile and couldn't get their hands
Right.
on an Eleiko and had to go wider, right? It's a similar question to like the difference between technique with a deadlift bar and a stiff bar. The technical difference is non-existent in the sense that a squat is still a squat. But there is an adjustment period. So, an adjustment period to the thickness of the bar in your hand that often then sits a little bit different on the shoulders. So, finding
Right.
out where your true bar position is, low bar, high bar. If you've got particularly interesting shapes in your upper back, that might impact it as well. So, like the people that have a short distance between, say, their occipital lobe, the base of their skull
Right.
and their shoulders. People that are like Hobbit build up here or dwarf build up here.
You're right.
Dwarf is in Lord of the Rings, not talking about little people.
Gimli.
Uh, yeah, well, those people with a squat bar, it almost turns into a high bar, whereas with a stiff bar, it'll still be a little bit closer to a low bar position. So it's really just adapting to what does that bar change for you. Most people end up having to take their grip out a little bit wider or taking their finger off, like going to a T-Rex kind of grip, just because of
Yeah.
the thickness
Talon.
of the bar. Um, Outside of that, very very little difference. The only other piece I'd say is exactly what I said at the start, where depending on the squat bar you're using, so the 32 millimeter Texas and Kabuki squat bars whip a lot more than the 35 millimeter versions, and they'll whip more than a stiff bar, and so that whip is nasty.
Yeah, I think that with that, like one of the things I've told lifters is like gripping slightly wider, like on the 32 millimeter bars can help out with that whip and having it be less extreme. But then there's the trade-off of like, you might have like a little bit less of the upper back tightness and like, like pull the bar
Yeah.
down into your back. It's definitely the hardest thing is just like if the bar rolls on your back, like it's just so hard to recover from that. I had it happen to me at my meet with like 240 and it rolled up my back and like it just completely zapped me for my third attempt. So I had to take
Yeah.
like my smaller jump. But I definitely I don't approach it that much differently other than like I said that and then sometimes maybe having like the bar slightly lower on your back because it might end up slightly higher with the whip and just how it's going to be. I also think sometimes you have to really cue more of that extension out of the hole. And sometimes people with a stronger back can excel a little bit more with a Texas bar versus if they're people like really like squatty. Um, have you seen like any differences with like how people come out of the hole with depending on if they have like really long or short femurs?
I mean, you mean specifically with the difference between a stiff bar, sorry, a 29 and a 32 millimeter bar? Or are you just talking
Well,
about now limb length in general?
I mean, kind of like a combination of the two, but I think like somewhat it's kind of somewhat similar. And with like if you have like the bar like whips up your back more, that kind of turns into a little bit more of a like um like longer femurs in some extent.
So yeah, I mean, if you're not used to the whip of the barbell, the only time it's really going to punish you, or the only two times it's really going to punish you, the heavier you go with it, the more just generally unstable and shaky you'll feel. So that can be a risk if you're not used to it, which is the same experience people get when they go from a stiff bar to a deadlift bar on deadlifts. But you'll get really punished if you've got a dive bomb style squat. Like if you just slam into the hole, you'll get thrown around like crazy. If you've got a relatively controlled squat, it shouldn't be that much of a difference once you've gone through that adjustment period, which is normally like a couple of weeks. The real challenge is going to be for lifters that enter into meets that use 32 millimeter squat bars that don't have access to them in training. That's
Yeah.
that's the real challenge. When like all of a sudden on competition day, the bar is completely different, the whip experience is completely different. It can throw you around like crazy. And to your point around like, does it emulate like a longer femur style squat? I mean, it really comes down to how is that person squatting in the first place.
Mhm.
Regardless, the whip is going to punish you if you're not used to it.
Yeah, and that's why I think that in general, if you look at the really strong squatters, going back to like your universal technique thing, they generally have a very controlled eccentric, and then they hit the hole pretty hard, and it lasts a little bit, and they come out of it, usually in a pretty good position to finish the lift. One last question about squat then would be, how do you decide whether or not an athlete would be more suited to putting on a heel or using flat-soled shoes?
So it comes down to you have to ask the question of like what is the heel actually changing? So imagine if someone puts on a heeled shoe, their torso isn't all of a sudden leaning forward like that. Like their whole body
Yeah,
isn't leaning forward. So they're counter correcting by shifting their weight backwards, right?
their
And
hips.
so
Yep.
the more front loaded whatever the lift they're doing is, the more that counter correction will help. That's why when you put on heels and you do an overhead press, it feels really good because the weight's out in front of you. And now you've counter corrected to have that center of mass more over the middle of your foot, right? And so, where a lifter will feel better in heels while they're doing a low bar back squat is if they can't control their brace and their hips to the point where they can't have a forward torso angle, the heeled shoe will shift some of that stability requirement to the front of their body. So they can afford a more upright torso, they can afford more knee travel. If you look at it purely technical, like if you're looking at it purely from an efficient moment arms distance traveled kind of perspective, no one would ever want to squat in a heeled shoe because you have to go more distance to hit
Yep.
depth. It's harder. It's a harder squat. But in practice, if you're missing some of that stability, some of that ability to hold a particular position, then heel shoes feel 10 times better. And so if your body is like, well, fuck, we can't keep moving down unless we distribute some of the load forward, that's how you solve depth with heels. It's like you haven't changed the person's ability to move through that range. All you've done is shifted the stability demand somewhere else. Like their body has the same range whether they're wearing shoes or not, right? And so how do you decide on that? Well, it comes down to, can the lifter perform the movement to the standard that you'd like to see? Do they perform it better with that heeled shoe? Like if they're missing completely bracing hip control, you'll probably fast track their bracing and hip control by adding the crutch of a heeled shoe. If all of that is said and done, they've got perfect squat, perfect bracing, perfect hip control, then it's just personal preference. Some people then just
Right.
prefer to wear a heeled shoe.
Yeah, I found sometimes so I've had some lifters who've had that issue of like always like going forward and then be put on a heel, and it does tend to help out. Sometimes I slightly does change the angle of inclination at the hip. It can cause like some hip pain. That's like sometimes what I would definitely say go back to a heel shoe, and then work on some more things with like maybe like stance width to like help out with depth.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So like if you again, and the same thing, if you put the heels on and it changes the experience at the hips, like so if somebody in a flat shoe is kicking their pelvis back, when they get to where depth should be, they've closed off. I can't demonstrate. They've closed off that gap, so their femur is going to run into their pelvis, and then you get
Yeah.
one of two things happen. You either go into a big butt wink, or you fold in half and you get really pinchy in the front of the hips.
Hmm.
And so you chuck a heel on, and all of a sudden that goes away. And again, it's just because you've shifted that demand. So now they can counterbalance back further, and now they can hit depth. So like it is a very, very, very valuable tool we have up our sleeves. It's not that one is right or wrong or one is better or worse. Absolutely none of that. It's more just like a tool that we've got in our toolbox. The important thing, if you decide to use that tool, so you identify, okay, well, this person needs to avoid these particular things because they can't brace or their hips are sore or whatever it is, that's not solving the root cause of the problem. And as coaches,
Hmm.
it's our job to then go, okay, what is actually the root cause of the problem and what do we need to be doing about that? Because you run the risk of then it just popping up its head in some other movement or in the squat itself eventually anyway.
Yeah, I've found that happen a lot of times. Like even for like some people who like it's like something that I find interesting about like the topic about technique and whatnot, and definitely just put out a good post on this today where you're saying that like a lot of times that bad fatigue or that bad technique can just be due to high amounts of fatigue, and enter in your whole thought process, which is it's funny because Lyle McDonald would tell you that this is not new. Most lifters train like a lot of lifters did train their squat machine up like once a week, and they got very, very, very strong. And sometimes like if someone's legitimately just not tolerating like even like a twice a week frequency on movement pattern, like doing a half squat or a belt squat instead, and then putting in more of the volume intensity on that once a week day can be a really good idea. One thing I'm curious about with the one time a week frequency, in my personal experience, I've seen that generally like the higher the frequency, you need to back off on the intensity, right? That's generally the trade-off you have to make. Whereas with the lower frequencies, you can generally afford to push intensity more. I was wondering about how you generally would structure the 1 time a week frequency things. I know that if I'm not mistaken, that's what you do with most of your lifters, and
Mhm.
how that might differ between the lift as far as like the average intensity you have them like work at and the amount of volume you might give like per lift.
Mhm. So the average intensity is pretty much the same all the time, which is somewhere between 1 and 2 reps in reserve. So high intensity all the time. So the percentage, like the percentage of your 1 rep max that you're working with, will undulate, will go through in waves depending on what we're working on for sure. But the actual intensity week to week is going to be very similar. So to give you a really quick idea, let's say we're doing 2 sets squat bench deadlift every week on their own individual days. The intensity might be, I'm talking in RIR, might be week 1 2 2, week 2 2 1, week 3 2 2, week 4 2 1. So high intensity all the time in terms of a true 2 RIR squat is fucking hard.
Yes,
Like
really hard.
it's hard. So we're training hard all the time, but we're only doing 2 sets. And so the progress is coming from all the other stuff, because squat bench deadlift is one of the worst ways to make yourself stronger, because strength is a measure of the adaptations that we make at the muscle. And once we understand the adaptations that we make at the muscle, then we can craft better pathways towards that strength. So in terms of structure and intensity, that's what it is. We'll wave through rep ranges because certain rep ranges will have certain qualities, and that's mainly from a technical perspective. So if we're working at, say, sets of 8, let's say I'm working with you, we're working on your squat, we're doing sets of 8, there'll be technical bottlenecks that you can't address at higher intensities, because above a certain intensity you can't control that position. So let's say your upper back sucks above 80%. If we train under 80%, now you've got a valuable training tool to address that upper back in that movement. So we'll wave through reps for that particular purpose, so we can work on micro aspects of technique, plus also just interest, plus training qualities like grit, like understanding what training towards failure is, like general
Right.
work capacity, fitness, whatever you want to call it.
It's really interesting because that's how I started off training. I had like very much like I had like basically it's like a 6 week like block. I do like 5-3-1, and I do like 6-4-2, and I would kind of just wave through that, and I would just train to like not repeat like like 1 to 2 RER two, and I would just make such good progress with that. And I have some athletes who like that's what I've done with them, especially if they're not responding to like the quote unquote like um you know neurological efficiency maxing USAPL split. Like it's like it's one of those things that it's a breath of fresh air, honestly, hearing your approach there, because I've always thought about this. It's like there's only so much muscle you can really grow from a squat bench and a deadlift too, especially with all the synergist muscles that come into play, and it causes a lot more fatigue. And I think a lot of times like people just um they just get to like where they're at because they have that good of genetics. And building muscle ultimately is going to be the number one long-term driver. But I really love what you said about to like developing grits and getting used to like that hard training and what that does feel like. What do you say that you also would incorporate, with your model, more of a block periodized model where like, you're like, volume, like, like eights, fives, and like ones or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, and the block periodization is really only on the main lift, on the
Right.
SBD. The rest of the program is pretty consistent what you'd expect to see in a modern hypertrophy programming scenario. So like we'll wave through, like, let's say a block is, I'll either work with direct reps based off the RIR, or a combination of rep ranges and RIR. So let's say we're doing like 8-8-6-6. That might be one block. The next block might be 6-5-5-4. The next block might be like 5-5-4-3, and then wave back around and keep
Yeah.
keep staying in that wash cycle over and over.
I think it makes a lot of sense too, especially with the higher intensity that you use. Like you kind of peak out each rep range faster. Um, but with how much you're putting on, you're focusing on hypertrophy, like you're still going to be making, as if you're gaining like one or like half a kilo or a kilo of muscle like per month, or body weight, that the weight should still be going up on the main movement. So only 2 sets a week is definitely, a lot of coaches would hear that and go, "Are you crazy? Are you out of your mind?" But clearly, it's it's working. I know Declan usually does
Let
like once a week, and like a single, like a 3x3 with like a pretty decent drop. I feel like the programs I've seen, so it's a little bit different than what you do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we're cut from a different cloth. He's much more on the hypertrophy side of things. I'm much more on the
Mhm.
powerlifting side of things. He's come up in a different era, of course, and I mean, all the love and respect to Declan. It's also funny, like hearing you say that most people would hear that and think it's crazy. I'm finding more and more that there's probably more people that are thinking in that way than the modern powerlifting meta. It's just we're so exposed to the modern powerlifting meta that we think that everyone programs
Yeah,
like that kind of thing. But it's also funny in the like I actually had a call this morning with one of the best IPF lifters on the planet. I won't throw him under the bus, but we had a consult. It was really cool talking about this stuff because I was analyzing his program and there's all this like justification around primary and secondary and priming the CNS and all these buzzwords that are thrown out there. When I look at the program, I just think it looks like what we all did when we started out, which is that we maxed out every week and tried to get stronger by doing that. And like looking at the program and putting a mirror to it and saying, okay, here's what it looks like to me. You're doing a near max here, near max here, near max here, single, single, single. If you had a noob that you were coaching, would you tell them to just try and max out every week to get stronger? Probably not. You'd probably say, do the work that's actually going to make you stronger. What makes us any different? Nothing. So,
right.
yeah, the label of low volume for 2 sets per week on squat, bench, deadlift, I think is unfair because I think it's adequate volume. It's just if you're used to seeing programs or adequate frequency, adequate volume. If you're used to seeing 5 bench sessions a week, 4 squat sessions a week, it looks like it's very low. It's just like, what is the anchor you're measuring it against?
Yeah, and I think that people underestimate to like how much that low end like, and again like Lyle, I think that it would be so interesting getting like you and Lyle on a podcast together because Lyle's view on it is like anything on that lower intensity side is just like wasted kind of junk volume you can put towards like hypertrophy work. It's like how much, especially with like someone like me, I've been lifting for like 8 years. Like I know how to squat, I know how to deadlift, I know how to bench. I don't need to like bench like eight times a week to like remember how to do it. It's like these are not that hard of movement patterns to really get down a fundamental level, in my personal
Well,
experience.
let's craft this interesting thought experiment then based on something that you've already said in this podcast so far. You mentioned before that fatigue is going to play a role in technique breaking down, right?
Right.
And so what you just said now is your experience. You're not going to forget how to bench if you don't bench every day. People get stuck in this paradigm where they're like, I have to bench 5 times a week. I have to bench 5 times a week because of the skill aspect. Every time I come in and bench, I'm fatigued. Therefore, my skill is falling apart. My skill is falling apart, so I need more frequency to address the skill. People stuck in this wash cycle where
Hmm.
they have created the need to do the thing more often because of the skill aspect, because their skill's falling apart because they do it so often. Because I agree wholeheartedly with you. You've been lifting for 8 years, man. Let's fly you out to Australia. Let's hang out on the Gold Coast. I'll take you up to the mountains. Let's go for a walk on the beach. You go home in 3 weeks. I guarantee you get on the bench. Maybe it feels a tiny bit rusty, but within one session, you're back to normal. Like you're not going to forget how to bench. And that's 3 weeks, let alone 3 days. So I think people have sold themselves the lie that these are high skill movements when they're really not. Squat, bench, deadlift are so simple. It's like riding a bike. If you haven't ridden a bike for 3 years, you suck when you get back on it for the first 5 minutes, and then you're fine.
Right. I think something else too that people forget, and I tell my lifters about this all the time, like your warm-ups count as technique practice. Like if you're warming up, that is a lot of technique practice. And a lot of times I see lifters tend to, I think that that's the higher volume and like the higher frequencies because people don't warm up enough on their main days. And if they just warm
Mm.
it up, like, 'cause I something I tell all my lifters, like, if it feels heavy as fuck when you get under the bar, you're not going heavy enough on your last warm up. But I laugh and I chuckle when I ask one of my friends, like at the gym, how that last warm up feel? Like shit, I'm going to go. I'm like, take it again. Like, you should probably try it again and see if that makes it feel better. So, if it's a warm up issue, then if it's intensity, then if you take it again, it feels better. Cool, you're more warmed up, and now you can go up to the single. Versus if your technique kind of feels rusty, it's like maybe just do more warm up, spend more time like under the bar. Because it doesn't matter how often like I'm like squatting per week. Like if I do not do enough reps or like really like do like some pause work and get like my hips comfortable in that in the hole, like I'm not going to feel good no matter how much volume I'm doing. I think that's a really underrated part too of technique is how you warm up instead of frequency.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I say over and over, people get sick of me saying it to them, is every single rep you do in training is an opportunity to practice, to improve, to get better. Make every rep mean something. It's an opportunity. And people warm up wrong because they try to be explosive and quick. If you're trying to fix your technique, you want to move slow and with purpose. Warm up slowly, move through, treat it like tempo work. Because when you go fast, all you do is reinforce the same movement pattern that breaks down when you max out. If you want to fix that, take it with purpose.
I love that point because like if you really do look at someone and they're breaking apart with like higher intensities when they get to working sets, it's like you can look at their warm-ups and it's like that's probably how they're moving on all their warm up sets. So how would you recommend then as far as like do you have like an actual way that you prescribe all of your athletes to warm up as far as like the specific under the bar work going up to their compounds, like working sets?
I give like a general guideline, but I don't have like a specific method to follow. My general advice is like more at the bottom and less at the top, because it's so dependent on the lifter, the preference of warm up, how many warm up jumps they have to take. If someone's squatting and deadlifting 400 is going to take a very different warm up path than somebody who's squatting and deadlifting 100 kilos, right? Uh, but in general, the main overarching point is what I just said, which is move slow, work on the things that we're actually trying to work on, prime the things that we're actually trying to prime, do it slow and with purpose. And generally, I just say, the first, you're way better off doing the empty bar twice and the first plate twice than just doing one set of that and skipping everything else on the way up, or putting more effort into the top end. Like get actual warm and actually warm and in those positions and prime in those positions. I don't think there's a perfect method to it though.
Right. And I think that's, I tell my lifters the same thing. It's like, do what makes you feel strong. Then that you're going to figure out
Yeah.
what that is. And for some people, it's like for me, I'm a very, very good deadlifter. I just do singles and I feel great. On my work, even regardless of how many reps I have. And I usually like, I feel really good. Whereas squat and bench, I do more reps because it's just not as, I just need more time to really feel comfortable. One other question I had with your adequate volume, or we'll say on squat, bench, and deadlift, if you see somebody who is coming into like a strength bottleneck, how do you like would you troubleshoot that with the programming? Was that something where it becomes a little bit more of the accessory programming strategy with like maybe augmenting that, or is there something else that you would do?
That's the first question, is why does that strength bottleneck exist? And
Mhm.
how are we measuring that strength bottleneck? Um, like for if we just throw out some random context, some, let's say the strength bottleneck is actually an illusion where there's been progress in training, but competition performance doesn't seem to hold up on a particular lift. Let's say bench, for example, their rep work has improved all the way up until they get to singles, then it falls apart. Maybe they need more neurological exposure to higher ends, whether that is truly neurological or just psychological. Maybe then I'm going to chuck in a double or a single before their rep work on bench press, just to get more comfortable with having something heavy in their hand, or some slingshot work or something like that. But there has to be a reason for strength bottlenecks somewhere. And oftentimes it's not even in the programming itself as much as the execution of the program, or the recovery nutrition outside of the gym. And if we say the recovery nutrition is perfect, it's normally just execution of the program. It's normally just people just kind of undercooking their accessory work, not pushing as hard
Yes,
as they should,
yes.
or the opposite, pushing way too hard and then having to cut back on everything towards the back end of the block because they're fucking cooked.
Yeah, I really just like respecting how the program is phrased. I definitely will say that with a lot of my programming, it's very hypertrophy heavy. Like kind of like what you do, I do less volume too. What most coaches would say is good for squat, bench, and deadlift. And a lot of times it's not working. Like I saw one of my clients. That's why I ask them more often now for like I at first like block. I need to see every exercise. I like what you think is like 2 reps in reserve. But a lot of times people just do not know what that is, especially if they come from the submax powerlifting, training style, where like they just do not know how to push hard. And one of the biggest tells of that for me is like if they're gaining weight, especially, and I'm not seeing muscle growth, I'm like, you're not pushing hard enough. Because that is like
Mm.
people always forget. It's like even on the drugs, even with like all the most optimized, like eating a million calories, it's the training and this and the intensity that does drive that up. And especially with powerlifting and my experience, um, enhancements, it's not like bodybuilding where it's like nuclear warfare, where it's like more and more and more and more because we are a performance sport and more drugs causes more stress with the sympathetic nervous
Mhm.
system. And that's what we're mainly, hammering a lot more with powerlifting than with bodybuilding with our really heavy, heavy lifts. Um, and like that's something where you really have to just communicate to the lifters and hold them to a higher standard in their training. And that's why I think it's so valuable for people to come from like quote unquote a bodybuilding background because they really do understand like this is what pushing hard feels like.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head with the comment around powerlifters. Maybe you didn't say sandbagging, but essentially sandbagging accessories. It's like we've been taught for the last 10, 12 years that you should never go to failure on anything. You should always leave a little bit in the tank when you do your squat, bench, deadlift. But people have just taken that context and applied it to everything. So they just do these half-baked sessions where you just go 3 by 10 rows, where you're just pulling the thing from point A to B with no real purpose or no real intent and no real intensity either. And powerlifters are really good at just leaving too much in the tank. It's like there's merit to it. We don't want to go to failure on everything, but fuck, if you want to get good, you have to be training hard. You have to be training really hard, just like hypertrophy. You have to be pushing hard, and like you have to push hard, and you have to overshoot a bunch of times to understand. You can't know where RPE 8 is or RIR 2 is until you've gone too far.
Are there any coaching strategies that you might use with an athlete who has a hard time pushing their accessories close to failure? Like say, you're just realizing that they're not pushing, accessories far enough. Are there maybe any programming strategies or psychology things you do with them to get them to actually execute the program properly?
I think programming some things to failure is a good idea. And like not I don't mean going week in, week out, hit this to failure, but when it's safe to do so, when fatigue is low, when there's an opportunity to show them how far they can actually go, you get some spotters on whatever movement it is, and you actually just push until you fail. Whether that's, a high output exercise like you're always sandbagging your leg press, get two people on the side, and you're going to push until you literally can't get another rep. Like learn what failure is. Because I think we're all especially bad at teaching ourselves that we know where failure is because we take some movements to failure. Like if you do a single arm tricep extension to failure, it's not that taxing. You just go
Yeah.
until you can't go anymore. You're like, I'm kind of done. A leg press to failure is a completely different animal.
Yeah.
Like your brain is telling you to stop way before your body is ready to stop. And most of us give into our brain, right? We're just like, this is hard, this is heavy, I've got lactic acid, whatever it is, I can't do anymore. Your body's got plenty more beyond that point on those high intensity exercises. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go out and squat to failure or bench press to failure or whatever it may be, because there's a risk or reward there. But every now and then, if you've forgotten or if you've never known, taking a a safe in a safe environment, taking a high output exercise to failure is a really quick way to know that, to know where your intensity truly is.
I especially think that's important. It's like a lot of people look at my programming and be like, that is low volume. I'm like, that's how hard I'm pushing on my sets. Like, I cannot recover from more than this. Like, my leg volume for my quads is literally I do one set of hacks or belt squat for like an RPE like 9, and then I do 2 mile rep sets of leg extensions per session, and I'm cooked, and my legs are growing. And like that's
That's
all I can
horrible.
do with my squat and with my deadlift. And if you look at it, that's like it's only 6 sets. But if you knew how to push yourself really hard, then you don't need much volume. And I think the volume honestly is it's a crutch for lack of effort. And even then, it doesn't work the way that people want it to because you actually have to recruit those high threshold motor units at some point to actually keep growing. Like you can't just do
Mm.
pumpy volume work.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Then you're just preaching to the choir big time. I love that. I really love that. And like what you just said about the RPE 9 set of hack squats and the two sets of my reps. My quads are screaming thinking about that because I
Yeah.
know exactly what that's going to feel like. Like a true RPE 9 hack squat, you are borderline dying. It's almost like you need someone there to be like, no, shut the fuck up. You've got more reps. Keep pushing. Like it's hard, and it's especially hard when you're doing it by yourself.
Oh, and the funny thing is that I tell my friend like, just watch me because like with how hard I'm pushing, like if I don't adapt for some reason or like 1 week, like I'm going to fail this 5 pound increase because I might have crossed that threshold and it's like you're like halfway through. You're like, well, I think that's actually a really good thing. I think I would attribute a lot of like my like leaning into the really hard and heavy SPD because I push so hard on like those machines. It's like I've learned to like love that feeling. Like I would so much rather like if someone's like going like I hate my taper meet because I have to like I still do a lot of my accessories, but I'm just blood flow to like get some fatigue down. And I'm like, it's how most people train. I can't believe it. Like I hate this. Like I love
Oh
that feeling
man,
of straining.
yeah, and this the switch to it, like anyone who's switched from hyper frequency, uh, low intensity to like one or two really hard sets of squats, and then a couple of really hard accessories, it just feels way better as well.
It's so much
Like you
fun.
feel like you're training way harder, you sleep better, you recover better. It's just like everything is a better experience.
I
It,
do
it
think
also,
that's a yeah, very good.
I was just going to say, it also tends to, for most lifters, wake up like that sort of almost adolescent training mindset where you just want to go fucking hard every session. Like we seem to dumb that down over the years when we do these, just like leave a bit in the tank. And when we wake that back up, you're just hungry to train and hungry to train really hard. And it's a great feeling.
Oh yeah, like I don't worry about fatigue. I don't worry about how hard I'm training. I just trust that my program is properly structured. And that is my biggest gripe with the whole like fatigue freak out on like social media. I'm like, if you're so worried about your fatigue it's because your programming sucks and or like people that think they have to like be in this massive calorie surplus to gain progress. It's like I was just joking about this today. It's like when your training program sucks so badly, you have to, eat in 1,000 calorie surplus to make progress. Like that's a sign like something's like broken. Um,
Yeah.
and a lot that's why a lot of times people kind of come back to like more of like this sort of thing. Or if you look at most of the biggest, strongest people in the world, they're not doing what a lot of people would say in a studies you have to do because it's just not practical when you are doing your training properly.
Yeah.
Cool, Thomas. Thank you so much for being willing to come on. I thoroughly enjoyed this. This was a lot of fun to talk, and I appreciate you being willing to donate your time. If people want to follow you and or hire you for their services, how can they do that?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, Tombro7, or the business is zero_weakness. Thanks for
Well,
having me, man.
yeah, of course, man. I'll include all that in the show notes. And to all the listeners, thank you guys for listening. I'll talk to you in the next episode.